There are many mysteries associated with human consciousness. The very act of being conscious is not understood. I'm going to try and give you a clue as to how consciousness does exist in an individual, and also help to explain how memory operates, something that many of us grieve about, and also how will and applied will, which is concentration, works, and also how character is maintained through the medium of the physical brain. None of these aspects of human consciousness are understood by science. Science has just not come up with any possible explanation as to how they work. The previous concept of man being a computer is something that is falling into disarray. Man is no computer. He is far, far greater than any computer that could ever be evolved on the planet, greater in consciousness. We have already begun to understand that assembled on the surface of the brain are a huge number of cells with cell bodies and processes coming from them. We know that these cell bodies give the brain surface its gray matter. We talk about the gray matter of the brain and the white matter of the brain. The gray matter being made up of these huge cell bodies, and the white matter being made up of their long processes, which go right down to the tip of the toes, for instance. And somehow or the other, consciousness hovers over this area. We know that in the forebrain there are regions which are associated with things like initiative, aggression, character, memory, association of ideas, and so on. And the world just does not understand how a man is able to pack into these comparatively few electrical pathways the sum total of knowledge lying in the Congressional Library, about 13 million volumes. For this is what man can memorize, as much information as lies in 13 million volumes. How is this achieved? If we studied these neurons on the surface of the brain, we would find they were very much like trees, very much like trees. Sort of root system and a sort of branching system above the neuron or cell body. They're like trees. The tree, of course, is the only four-dimensional object that we have virtually existing in the world. It's the symbol of a four-dimensional object. You remember my talks on Ouspensky's theories of other dimensions? You'll remember how the first dimension is considered to be a point taken to infinity, an infinite number of points which make up a line, one dimension, the common factor of dimensions being infinity. And Ouspensky pointed out how you can take an infinite number of lines, extend the straight line infinitely, and you get evolving a plane. That's length now times breadth. Length, an infinite number of points, making a line, one dimension, an infinite number of lines laid in a plane, making a plane, in fact, two dimensions, length times breadth. Take an infinite number of planes stacked on top of each other, like that, stacked on top of each other, and we've got the third dimension. We've got the third dimension, length times breadth times height. And so the question then arises, what is the fourth dimension? If we apply the concept of taking the quality of a dimension to infinity, then we wonder how this possible fourth dimension can be explained. What we would have to do in terms of an object like a cube, or this box drawing that I have put on the board, is to take its surfaces to infinity. Take its surfaces to infinity. When we do that, we get a ridiculous object. But now I take you back to the study of a tree. Take you back to a study of a tree where we have the tree acting as a bridgeway between a root system and a system of branches. We see that in the tree we have surfaces being taken to infinity. The growing points of the tree are the tips of the meristems and the tips of the roots. That's where this tree is growing. It's growing in all directions. the surface areas of the tree meristems are growing outwards in all directions. And so somehow or the other, in this Ouspensky line of reasoning, a fifth-ray reasoning method based on Gurdjieff, then we must accept that the tree is the only tangible physical object that seems to demonstrate the fourth dimension, taking surfaces to infinity as it does on the tips of its branches. Now I must swing you back to the concept of the huge cells on the surface of the brain, pyramidal-shaped cells on the surface of the brain, and ask you to think of them now in terms of trees, We can get, by our occult knowledge, an understanding of how consciousness and character and all the other processes that I have described evolve. Here in the gray matter of the cortex of the brain lies the cell bodies. From there grow upwards, as it were, outwards, the processes, the sensory processes of the cell, the dendrites, as we would call them, in the cell body below them, and again a root system branching out below the body of the cell. Billions of them on the surface of the brain, forming themselves a sort of interpenetrating forest of four-dimensional objects, each one of them transmitting electrical impulses. Somehow or the other, it is said by science that an electrical impulse builds up on the surface of the brain, and we decide to scratch our cheeks. And a flash of electricity then flows down this motor nerve from the surface of the brain to the pons of the midbrain, there jumps onto another circuit, travels down the spine, and from the spine jumps into another circuit towards the tip of the finger, where it activates muscles and we scratch the tip of our nose along. So somehow or the other, consciousness is built up there. It derives from an electrical force whose origin is unknown. Let us take one of these cells, these giant cells, and magnify it somewhat. And we find, again, the idea of the tree. But now we can go into our occult knowledge to find the source of consciousness. We can say that indeed this is true, but we know that wherever that cell lies, there are etheric processes underlying it. There are etheric processes underlying it. Wherever it manifests, it has an etheric matrix. And the matrix extends beyond the cell, creating a corona effect on the surface of the skin, of the scalp, of the brain, all over the body. And this is being photographed in Kirlian photography. But we know better than this, even. We know that the cell, in its physical nature and its etheric background, is interpenetrated also by the astral field. And it has an astral matrix to the etheric. And these astral force flows extend well beyond the etheric on the surface of the brain. And we must go even further than this and say that there is interpenetrating these also the mental body of man. The mental body of man. And the mental body possesses potential for mentation far in excess than anything astral or etheric. And so these processes that I have tried to describe here are in fact representative of the totality of man, And genius can only be explained in terms of this. Genius explained in terms of permanent atoms that have attracted to them in mental substance, a mental sheath which evolves into a mental body which is en rapport with the totality of mental experience in previous lives. This explains genius. It explains such things as character, the ability of the individual to show mental persistence, which we describe as will. There is no other explanation for memory, the ability of a human mind to hold the contents of 13 million volumes. There is no explanation for two identical brains the one being a criminal brain and the other being a genius, indistinguishable from the point of view of their histology, the structure of their cells, and yet so obviously different, patently different as they appear to us in terms of their character. And it is this that supplies the huge aura, the great disk of light seen about the saints, because I have not added here the Atma, Buddhi, and Manas of the spiritual essence of that individual, or I would have to climb to the top of the hotel to put in more accurate detail the streams of spiritual energy that flash down into the vehicle of the monad. Always remember that a physical man, in comparison to the power, the strength, the omniscience, the omnipotence of his monad, is like a tiny quarter piece compared to a state capital, which is his monad. The monad can only be hinted at here in terms of the glorious energies of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, which come from the higher triad. We must always think of this, these capacities of man, this potential of man, when we look at an individual that we're going to approach from the point of view of healing. Surely this equipment is more precious than the physical body. The sacrifice of a physical body through some illness would be regarded as very, very recommendable to the soul and the monad of that individual if by dying of that disease some difficulty in karma is eradicated forever. But don't always think that it's absolutely primarily important that the physical body must survive under all circumstances. Far from it indeed. It is the growth of this part of man that is far more important. And if pain and suffering is needed to round out some defect in a permanent atom so as to express the spiritual Atma, Buddhi, and Manas more in an individual in the life that follows, then that illness has been worthwhile. So when we think of man, we must think of him as a totality. Now, the metamorphosis of man, a changing of man into a higher being, is monitored not only by these inner worlds, these inner vehicles of consciousness, but it is monitored in the purely physical body by the endocrine gland, These glands are of prime importance. Probably the endocrine system as a whole, is more important and can be reached more easily than any other in esoteric healing. And we must therefore give quite a deal of consideration to the endocrine glands of man. If you were to take the frog as an example of metamorphosis, you would be able to see the frog's egg lying in the water, surrounded with its slimy material, keeps it a necessary distance from other eggs, ensuring that it is oxygenated. The eggs were all packed together, they would soon die of deoxygenation. The frog's eggs are kept apart by this slimy globular mass. We watch the egg slowly change into a writhing little object, an embryo. Then after a while, the egg surroundings are removed. You have the primitive tadpole that produces later a set of gills, and then changes the gills for a set of lungs, and begins to push out his arms and his legs, moves towards the edge of the water, hangs around the bank side, as it were, and eventually hops ashore and spends his time half on land and half on water, and finally almost entirely on land, only to come back to the water to lay his egg. What monitors that extraordinary change, that metamorphosis? What enables a being of that type to lift itself out of one dimension, one medium, into another, and live a completely different sort of existence? Much as man is trying to lift himself out of the waters of the emotion, into the world of mentality, from the world of mentality into the world of higher manas, there may be contacted the great masters of the wisdom. For the frog, it is an endocrine gland. For the axolotl, it's an endocrine gland. What has done this? The thyroid gland. Done that for a tadpole, changing it into a frog, the axolotl into a land animal, and of course the thyroid possesses tremendous potential in man. The chakra, 16-petaled lotus. Thyroid gland is related to the 16-petaled lotus from the third ray of active intelligence. This ray is related particularly, and this endocrine gland and this chakra, to the fifth root race, our own, whose target is active intelligence. And this chakra stands at the apex of the pranic triangle. Pranic triangle, which is focused on the thoracic cage where breathing, focused on the thoracic cage where breathing is done. No entry into the kingdom of God except through the throat chakra. There must be metamorphosis which can only be obtained through the throat chakra. The metamorphosis demands, ultimately, the integration of personality. And so we have to consider a number of endocrine glands and their chakras from the point of view of esoteric healing. Temptation to go off into discipleship at the drop of a hat at any time is very, very strong always, but we must stick to esoteric healing. So we come to consider the thyroid gland. It lies just below thyroid cartilage, and you can feel the top of the thyroid cartilage with your Adam's apple here. And the thyroid cartilage, when you dissect it, looks something like that, sort of a shield that protects the larynx behind it. And below the thyroid cartilage is the substance of the thyroid gland. Two lobes which are linked together by little isthmus, and they are, as it were, shielded also by the sternum bone here. You can feel the loop of the sternum just in front of this area, the thyroid gland. I am not going to go into a description of its cells. It's made up of little sacs or acini containing, if you cut one of these sacs open, you would find that it was a little bowl containing a liquor or a liquor, a yellowish material, and that would be the thyroid secretion known as thyroxin. And thousands of these little follicles make up one of these lobes of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland cannot function without iodine. It must have iodine. And iodine is a rare commodity in the internal areas of land masses, like ballast. Any internal area long way from the sea is a place where iodine is scarce. Iodine is blown inland from the sea area with bits of seaweed. Seaweed is very rich in iodine. We talk about kelp. Some of us in these areas need to take a little bit of kelp. In an esoteric medicine of the future, we will describe why it is that iodine should be taken when the thyroid is depleted or when it is excessive. When we have an overactive thyroid, we call it hyperthyroidism. When we have a low thyroid, it's low hypothyroidism. Hyper and hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism, excessive activity of the gland. What does it do? Thyroid material is secreted as a hormone into the blood. No duct. Endocrine glands are organs that secrete their material straight into the blood. What does thyroid material or thyroxin do? It increases the metabolic rate of the body. The thyroxin acts on every cell in the body and makes it burn energy faster. It will burn sugar in the presence of oxygen, which is what we call internal respiration, or quickly, all over the body. Those cells are exempt. And so we call the thyroid gland a great pacemaker of the body, And a person who has excessive activity of the thyroid gland is a person who's burning himself up, and they're thin because they're burning so much fuel up. They can't put on weight, and they're always hungry, tremendous appetite. because they're burning up the fuel as fast as they're taking it in. And they're trembly. And the first test that you make for thyroidism, hyperthyroidism, is to ask your patient to spread his fingers out in front of him. If the fingers are trembling very slightly, a fine tremble, this can indicate hyperthyroidism. It means that they're not only burning up energy, but they are using up oxygen at a tremendous rate. Indeed, the old days we used to measure the degree of hyperthyroidism by the amount of oxygen consumed by the individual. An individual might consume as much as 40% more oxygen than a normal person, implying all sorts of things. The condition also causes the deposition of fatty material behind the eyeballs, so that the eyes start out from their sockets, and this is a characteristic which can be seen quite clearly. You don't often see it today because thyrotoxicosis, hyperthyroidism is rarely seen because it's so easily overcome. Sometimes individuals won't respond to iodine treatment, and they have to have most of their thyroid removed. It is a condition which is basically linked to the throat chakra. Some individuals, especially when iodine is in poor supply, are unable to cope with the inflow of energies coming from the sacral center to the throat. Inhibition of the sacral center has come at such a time that the throat chakra is unable to cope with the increased flow of energy. The throat chakra is overstimulated, which causes excessive production of thyroxin, the raising of the metabolic rate of the individual. All men treading the path are susceptible to hyperthyroidism. The thyroid affects in its secretion many parts of the body, some discovered, some not discovered. The larynx itself, the word expressed, is affected by the thyroid gland secretion and by the thyroid chakra, the throat center, the larynx, center of power, expressive power in the body. Again, I can't branch off into discipleship. In women, the thyroid gland during pregnancy tends to secrete, if I remember rightly, a material which relaxes the ligaments holding the pelvic bones together, allowing the pelvis to expand under the pressure of the child going through the birth canal, and so on. I can only tell you that this is the focus of attention of disciples who are attempting to integrate their personalities, to make them completely rounded out, so that they can become an instrument of the divine, of the master, can be used by the master. The master knows that the instrument is true and strong and sharp, will not break up in his hands. He will not use them fully until they are rounded out. Then there is hypothyroidism, where insufficient iodine can cause the gland to swell and produce useless material, alloy that is useless. And the hyperthyroid swelling is known as a goiter, G-O-I-T-R-E. Today we never see large goiters. Occasionally a woman has swelling in the throat, a little bit of adjustment, diet with iodized salt can remove any chance of hypothyroidism, iodized salt. On the other hand, she may have to have an operation. In old days, the thyroid goiter could be so enormous that it could weigh almost as much as the body itself. It's a common sight in Switzerland, which is in the center of a land mass, miles and miles from the sea. A common sight in old days to see a person with a goiter moving around with a wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow contained the goiter. As I say, this is an extraordinary gland of metamorphosis. Always remember that the human body, from tip to toe, from physical body up to atmic body, has the ability to adapt itself to every circumstance in the universe. To heat, cold, to a fiery environment, to an environment that is low in gravitational pull and high in gravitational pull. Humanity exists all over the universe, is merely adapted to conditions. If gravity on Jupiter is immense, it means that man on Jupiter is still man, but with a frame like mine or yours, would weigh only about 20 pounds, thus is able to cope with gravity. He is sacral, etherico-physical rather than physico-etheric. The thyroid gland, an intensely interesting gland. It is monitored by the pituitary gland. It is monitored by the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is even more mysterious and occult than the thyroid gland. It has an extremely occult background to it. The pituitary gland in the baby arises from the roof of the mouth. In the fetus, part of the roof of the mouth is pulled away upwards towards the brain, and at the same time part of the brain, the third ventricle of the brain, begins to move down, and eventually we get the formation of the anterior pituitary gland, which lies in the floor of the brain, floor of the third ventricle. We get a posterior pituitary gland derived from the brain, and we get an anterior pituitary gland which is derived from the roof of the mouth. Two together make the pituitary gland. There it is. Putting in the other features as follows. Pituitary gland lies in the stella turcica, a nice saddle talk called a Turkish saddle. It is protected by bone, and it lies very close to one of the sinuses here called the sphenoid sinus. The sphenoid sinus, S-P-H-E-N-O-I-D. And many sounds that we make resonate because of the sinuses. Our noses are blocked. When we're ill, then we don't resonate properly. We make funny noises when we speak, because the sinuses are not resonating our sound. It is obvious that the sinuses resonate to certain sounds. The sphenoid sinus resonates to sounds including parts of the Om. And with the resonation of the sphenoid sinus, there is stimulation of the pituitary gland. Stimulation by vibration rather than by other mechanisms. The pituitary gland is divided into the anterior and posterior lobes. The anterior part of the pituitary has a tremendous number of functions. In the early days of man's physical being, which go back about 19 million years ago, when men were fast materializing, from that period on, the pituitary gland played a tremendous part in conjunction with the pineal gland. Pineal gland lies a little above the pituitary gland and is an invagination of the same third ventricle of the brain. There's the third ventricle of the brain. There's the pineal. The pineal gland was responsible to a great extent for the fall of man. It was the instrument by which man was able to fall. And the fall of man was an act undertaken by certain monads who set out to do two things. Firstly, they needed to develop in their spiritual equipment staying power, and the way to obtain it was to become enmeshed in matter and to extricate themselves. And in the process of learning to extricate themselves from a material involvement, they developed staying power, spiritual staying power. The other object of the descent of the monads was, in fact, to lift the lower kingdoms of nature, mineral, plant, the animal, and the human kingdom. These are known as the divine rebels. They were led in Christian mysticism, and in the Old Testament they were led by Satan. They plunged from their monadic height into the earth scheme, and that was their task. Not everyone is a divine rebel. There are very few upon the earth. Others entered the scheme under the normal processes of evolution. Occasionally we get a Plato, and a Christ, and a Buddha, and a Swedenborg. And these are the divine rebels that have come in, deliberately setting aside their own spiritual unfoldment for eons. They come in to assist these four kingdoms of nature, and at the same time develop the staying power necessary for their future unfoldment as solar logi. That was a nice excursion into discipleship, wasn't it? It was all meant to tell you something about the potential of the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland assisted the pineal, and the pineal assisted the pituitary gland in obtaining the engrossment, the enmeshment attachment with matter. And it was a bitter process. Some of the monads even tried to pull out of it. So shocked were they by the kind of human form that they had to become engrossed with. In the later stages of Lemuria and in early Atlantis, there were giants on the earth. There were giants on the earth. And the pituitary gland, assisted by the the increased gravitational pull of the moon, produced giants, 20 feet in height, human giants. So easy for us to talk about the brontosaurus and the dinosaurus and how animals were huge. The elephant is as nothing compared to the mammoth. Why then should there not have been greater human beings on the earth? And there were. We have few specimens of them. Still to this day we find huge human teeth in China. It is said that under the Potala in Tibet there is, in a subterranean cavern known to the masters, a 20-foot human colossus. They were monsters in the latter part of their time, and their degeneration occurred through their interbreeding with animal forms. The sexuality of man developed with the inhibition of the pineal gland. As the two eyes developed, the eyes that looked into the outer world developed increasingly. The pineal gland withdrew into atrophy. The pineal gland still to this day inhibits sexual maturation. Occasionally, with the complete destruction of the pineal gland by tumors, where the pineal gland can no longer inhibit at all, we get sexually precocious children, especially boys. The boy of 4 may have the organs of an adult under this pineal tumor. And so between the two glands there was produced all sorts of opportunities for man to change his nature and to adapt himself to the demands of the 7 rounds which the earth was going through. We have been through 4 of them already, nearly. And men were red in color and blue and many other colors. And of course, the 2 glands that I have mentioned are concerned with the pigmentation of the skin, the pigmentation of the skin. And the deposition of pigment in the skin is related to these 2 glands. The pigmentation of the human blood was due to these 2 glands, unknown to medical science. The human blood system, as I described it in my first night's talk, was hardly pigmented at all in the beginning. In fact, the lymphatic system did most of the work. But as the human blood system began to develop, it became more pigmented. The more pigmented it became, the more it was able to carry oxygen, and the less the necessity for the spleen chakra to function, taking in prana directly instead of through the blood. The spleen chakra moved over with the shrinking of the spleen itself to reside today under the margin of the left rib, the base of the thoracic cage. And so we have hormones of a huge variety from the pituitary gland. There is a hormone known as the growth hormone, excessive activity of which can produce gigantism and produce human giants. Its activity is inhibited by the sexual hormones to some extent. And if the sex glands in a male are removed, then the growth hormone will act upon the epiphyses of the bones and produce very, very tall humans, known as eunuchs. The anterior pituitary gland secretes a thyroid-stimulating hormone. We're talking about a gland that increasingly is coming under the attention of the initiates and disciples of the 5th root race, who have produced already integration of the throat chakra and are moving to the brow chakra. For the pituitary gland is related to the brow chakra. And stimulation of the brow chakra implies stimulation of the pituitary gland above what is normal for average man. And we are beseeched to undertake certain spiritual disciplines of discipleship. Discipleship, same word. To allow for, to cater for, overstimulation of the pituitary gland. Yeah, with salt and meditation. As the pituitary gland has an effect on the adrenal glands, which tend to absorb salt, cause the absorption of salt through a hormone called aldosterone. We're told to be extremely careful about many things when we focus our attention on the brow. Otherwise you will produce gigantism, not perhaps in the physical body, if it becomes the attention in middle age, although many women demonstrate gigantism in what we call acromegaly, the latter part of their lives, when the female sexual organs are no longer functioning, or are not functioning at all. They should be functioning vitally. The lack of inhibition on the growth hormone can produce growth in certain parts of the body at that late age, like a huge chin, or enlargement of the hands and feet, acromegaly, the imposition of gigantism on a person who's stopped growing. So we see that this pituitary gland influences almost all the others. It acts on the thyroid gland with a thyrotropic hormone. It even acts on the pancreas. The pancreas, you will remember, is an endocrine gland concerned with maintaining the level of sugar in the blood, regulating the level of sugar in the blood. And there is a diabetogenic hormone secreted by the pituitary. So the pituitary gland can be antagonistic to insulin. And some of us who tread the path plunge into meditation or into one-pointed focus and other esoteric demands without being careful of the discipline that should accompany them. We move into diabetes, a diabetogenic hormone secreted from the pituitary, antagonistic to the pancreas. So we have the vagus nerve lowering the blood sugar through causing excessive secretion of insulin, and we have the pituitary gland acting against this through the action of the diabetogenic hormone. The pituitary gland stimulates growth of the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands produce inflammatory material. They also produce anti-inflammatory material like cortisone. We'll talk about the adrenals in a moment. But then, of course, the pituitary gland is responsible in assisting the pineal gland in maintaining cycles in the body. Man is cyclic by nature because he grew up in a cyclic planet, in a psychic planetary scheme, a cyclic planetary scheme. And we reflect in miniature the great cycles, the manvantaras and the pralayas of our solar system. The pituitary gland secretes two female hormones which set in motion the growth of the female sex organ and their periodic activity. Similarly, in the male, the pituitary gland will stimulate growth of the male organs, the secondary sexual characteristics. And so the pituitary gland with the pineal were responsible for the two great sins. The first was the fall into matter. The second was the mingling of human forms with anthropoid forms, I should say animal forms. Apes have not always been on this planet. They are comparatively late comers. Mankind has always been on the planet. His evolution on the planet goes back something like 4,000 million years. The anthropoids evolved as the result of miscegenation between man and female beasts on the earth, female animals. In fact, the whole process of man developing into separate sexes out of the bisexual stage was monitored by the pituitary gland and in conjunction with the pineal as it regressed. So this is the pituitary gland. We'll understand more about it when we come to consider the other endocrine glands individually. We're always looking for methods of stimulating the pituitary gland. We know that light in the springtime stimulates the pituitary gland to make mating, sexual activity increase in animals. We know that the pineal gland is related to light as it strikes the retina of the eye. We come then to consider the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a midbrain structure. In the middle of the brain we have the third ventricle, which is a hollow containing cerebrospinal fluid, and it is linked to the long spinal canal, which contains spinal fluid, and therefore it is a place of importance also because it is the north pole of the magnetic aura, and at the base of the third ventricle is the hypothalamus, which is an endocrine gland, and it is the seat of emotional control, and therefore of paramount importance to the disciple. There's the pituitary gland, just there. The pineal gland, and there's a vagination of this third ventricle, just there. By an vagination we mean that it is bathed, if you like, with the fluid of the cerebrospinal fluid of the third ventricle. There it is, pineal gland, about the size of a pea. It was once much enlarged, and in that capacity, in the earliest men, inhibited separation of the sexes. Man remained androgynous, bisexual, until the pineal gland regressed. And as it regressed, it became not only smaller but more consolidated and fleshy. The mystery of the third eye is dual. There are two third eyes in many respects. There is the third eye that you and I will open, or are opening, with the integration of the three head chakras so that they overlap to produce a vortex of energy which emits, or can emit, the horn of the unicorn. That I have described again and again to you in the past. You can find this in my various books. But in the earliest days there were two parts to the pineal system. There was not only the pineal gland, but there was attached to it, and is still to be seen in the lower types of animals, which was known as the parapineal gland. The parapineal gland. And it was this gland in man, in early days, as an organ which can still be seen in the hagfish, the tuatara lizard, and even in the frog. You can see elements of the parapineal gland. But with the growth of the eyes and their increasing prominence and direction in man's outer activities, parapineal gland withdrew, regressed, and almost disappeared entirely, so it's not seen in mankind today. But always remember that man antecedes even the plant kingdom on the earth. The plant kingdom has been influenced tremendously by man. And the potential in any plant, in any animal, exists in man. This was why I was so sure that certain cells in the body fix nitrogen. How we know that they do. I was sure 10 years ago that because we have the potential there. That doesn't mean to say we don't manifest it. But anything that a plant can do and an animal can do, we can do, or have done already. But also remember that the plumage and the foliage of the plumage of animals and the display, glorious colors and displays, are related to sexuality and the pituitary gland. The pineal gland, it is still responsible for the inhibition of sexual maturity, and it's highly active. It inhibits it, still to this day. It is the great clock-setting mechanism in the body, still to this day. It sets the body clocks, and it's activated by means of light coming in the eyes. And the light that comes in the eyes triggers off nerve pathways that go to the sympathetic ganglion, and from there back again to the pineal gland. And if we are subjected to a long flight from London to Dallas, and we have an experience of 18 hours of sunlight, we're all messed up for 3 or 4 days. Our body clocks are all out of alignment. We need a period to sort ourselves out again as the pineal gland resets the body clocks. In the years to come, it will be found that the pineal gland has a great effect on the aging processes. The pineal gland contains pigment very similar to the human eye. It will be found that this pigment reacts to light, which can be as dim as the full moon, but it will react to it. Also found in the pineal gland are little grains of calcium. It was once believed that these grains of calcium were related to the spiritual activity of the individual. And if he was highly spiritual and had lots of spiritual ohat flowing through him, through his head center, he had lots of grains of calcium. Not true. Calcium granules are indicative of the atrophy of the pineal gland. In fact, all tissue that tends to atrophy forms calcium granules. Pineal gland will not manifest its true spiritual correlations until the 6th and 7th root races. billions of years from now. It will be found that the pineal gland has a strong connection with the endocrine glands above the kidneys, which are related to the chakra at the base of the spine. It has been taught traditionally in yoga that the chakra at the base of the spine has an alter ego, which is the 1,000-petaled lotus. And the 1,000-petaled lotus's endocrine gland is the pineal. The pineal gland is ruled by Uranus, and Uranus is the great planet of cycles. It's also the planet of higher creativeness. Very few people respond to that planet. Only the most spiritual of disciples can really say that Uranus works in their horoscopes. But nevertheless, the pineal gland is the focal point of the 1,000-petaled lotus. And higher impressions, spiritual impressions, are flashed onto the bloodstream of the brain that I described the other night. The bloodstream of the brain. That blood film that exists in many dimensions as the result of end arteries pouring into it. Arteries that are not found in any other part of the body. Produces a three-dimensional screen onto which is projected the higher impressions of the 1,000-petaled lotus, physically through the pineal gland onto the blood. Adam Blavatsky called the pineal gland the uterus of the brain. Uterus because it is an evagination, like a uterus. Uterus because it is the place where the seed thought is nurtured. And the higher thoughts that are seeded into man's brain by the masters, the higher thoughts are seeded into this part of man's anatomy, projected onto the stream of blood that I have described. We're talking about the endocrine glands, and I would remind you again that these glands secrete their hormones directly into the blood, which means that these hormones are presented to every cell in the body, but only certain cells make use of the hormones. Only certain cells make use of them. The next set of glands that we should consider are those which seat themselves above the kidneys. They are called the suprarenal glands because they are superior to, above the kidneys. They're like two French cocked hats, and they are seated above the kidneys in this position. They are yellowish in color, yellow-orange in color, and they have two aspects to them. You take each one of them and you slice it sagittally. That's the shape that reveals itself. There is an outer cortex to the gland, and there is an inner medulla to the gland. An outer cortex and an inner medulla. The medulla is really the instrument of the sympathetic nervous system. It secretes the hormone known as adrenaline. And adrenaline is said to prepare the body for fight or flight. And this decision is made. In a run, in a fight, body needs to put into act for it. Immediately, the adrenaline speeds the rate of the heart up. As a sympathetic action, heart begins to beat rapidly. 80, 90, 120, 160 of the normal 70. The result is that more blood is made available to the muscle. Because there's more blood is under pressure, there's more sugar available to muscle cells. There's more oxygen. There's more of everything. Adrenaline will constrict the arteries in the intestine. Body's not going to bother about digesting food, and it must fly. So the blood is pumped out of the intestine. Nobody wants to eat head. Stomach becomes a tight knot. Chests are all knotted up. Just held down by the static action. The individual begins to sweat, which will cool him down as he's running. Most important. Or as he's fighting. That is through adrenaline. His eyes are made to dilate. More light comes in through the eyes so that he can see better his adversary, where he's going and what he's doing. Now all these activities tend to engage a man in his environment more. They can able to face a situation and survive. And this is antagonistic to turning inwards. This is the material of the adrenal medulla. Will also make the liver secrete sugar. And sugar stored as glycogen in the liver or in the muscles is turned into glucose. So the body is prepared for fight and flight. But then we have the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, which produces a completely different set of hormones altogether. These hormones will produce hormones which will assist the metabolism of carbohydrates, will give the individual great ability to survive stress for a certain time anyway. Give him drive and power. They will cause salts to be retained in the body. Instead of being urinated away, salts will be retained. These hormones will assist in the production of sex hormones and so on. They produce a cortisone-like material which has an anti-inflammatory effect on the body. If you've done inflammation, look up inflammation, and anything that is inflammatory tends to be, as it were, reduced. The effects are reduced by the secretion of cortisone-like materials from the cortex. The esoteric importance of these glands is that they are related to the chakra at the base of the spine, and they are acted upon by the adrenal medulla, by the pineal gland. The pineal gland has some sort of effect on aldosterone, the hormone secreted by the cortex, one of the steroids secreted by the cortex, affecting the amount of salt held in the body. We've dealt sufficiently with the pancreas. We have dealt with the thymus gland. I'm going to deal with the gonads. The female ovaries and the male testes, which are their opposite number, derive from the kidney. Just as the kidney is made up of many little tubules, well, the early part of the kidney, the pronephros, I believe, if I remember rightly. I'm sure you think I go home and swat all this up at night, but I don't. The lower part of the kidney separates itself in the embryo, in uterus, and this becomes a discrete organ of its own. It becomes the ovaries in the female, and it becomes the testes in the male. And the ovaries move a short distance to take up their position as part of the genital tract of the female. But with the male, a very extraordinary process is undertaken. In the male, a piece of tissue called the gubernaculum, you'll never have to remember that, fortunately, the gubernaculum starts to draw the testes away from the kidneys and takes them right down to the pubic bone. Pubic bone. Feel your pubic bone just here, the arch of the pubis. And the gubernaculum draws the testes right out of the body, right out of the abdomen, pulls them through the abdominal wall of muscle, draws them through the aperture, the inguinal region, and eventually they come to settle in the scrotum outside the abdomen, where, in circumstances which are cooler, they are able to produce the sperms, the male germ cells, which can mature there, but not inside the abdomen. If as a result of insufficient maturation, perhaps monitored by the pineal gland, the testes do not descend sufficiently, and one of them is held inside the abdomen, it will be immature, will not produce fertile sperms. It may even become cancerous. And so this is the basic origin of the male and female parts from the opposite pole of the kidney to where the suprarenal glands derive. We'll do the female organs first, and the female organs are characterized by a hair growth on the body which is diamond-shaped. In the male, the hair growth is, in the female it is an inverted triangle. The hair growth in the female is an inverted triangle, and in the male it is diamond-shaped. It is diamond-shaped. The ovaries, attached to a ligament, lie very closely, they lie very near to an opening of the egg duct or fallopian tubes. And these fallopian tubes are meant to carry an egg down into the uterus. The uterus is a little pear-shaped gland about the size of a small pear, and it is connected to these oviducts which enter it, like that. So here we have the ovary, attached by the ovarian ligament to the wall, the abdomen, ovary, there is the oviducts, or fallopian tubes, the ducts that carry the ovum, the ovi, the eggs. Then the opening of the uterus is called the cervix. It is about the size of the lead of a pencil, tiny little opening, and it opens into the vagina, which is a muscular canal, collapsed as it were, and ringed by muscle, and under voluntary control of the will, whereas the uterus is under involuntary control and therefore part of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the other organs that we should draw in, and I'm going to draw them out of place, is the female bladder, which, as you know, is used by the kidneys to store urine. Each kidney secretes its urine into a ureter tube, which directs the filtrated material of the kidneys into the reservoir known as the bladder. Bladder has an opening known as the urethra, and the urethra finds its way into the wall of the vagina, like that. So those, somewhat spread out, are the female organs. The opening of the vagina is marked with an internal pair of lips known as the labia minora. Labia means lips, minora, the small, and an external pair known as the labia majora, the large lips of the organism. Now, my subject here is the subject of the endocrine glands and their effects, and what happens each monthly cycle. Remember, this is a cycle that is retained from the time that the moon was closer to the earth and is imprinted on the female sex, period of about 28 days, during which the uterus, which I'm enlarging here, grows an organ, grows a specialized organ. And this organ is known as the endometrium. It grows a lining each 28 days. There it is. The lining thickens and thickens progressively over this 28 days. First of all, after the menstrual period of bleeding, the new lining is fairly thin. It gradually thickens and thickens as the 28 days elapses and builds tubules into it and blood vessels and so on, and eventually reaches its maximum thickness. This is monitored, this is under the influence of the pituitary gland, which acts on the ovary, and the ovary erupts an egg once every 28 days at the time of ovulation, and the egg is drawn into the oviduct and passes down over a period of 2 or 3 days into the uterus. If the egg has been fertilized, then it will embed itself in the wall of the uterus, that is the endometrium. It will embed itself in the wall of the uterus, which has been prepared for it under the same mechanism, or if it is not fertilized, it will pass out from the uterus. Each month, this endometrium is built up under the influence of 2 female hormones. The first one is estrogen, which is secreted from the ovary as the egg is growing each 28-day period. Surrounding the egg is a bag of liquid called a follicle, and this liquid produces the hormone estrogen, which passes into the blood, and the estrogen triggers off the wall of the uterus to produce its lining or endometrium. When the egg erupts from the surface of the ovary, it leaves behind it a body, an organ, a gap, a space which fills in with tissue and becomes an organ, a corpus luteum, which produces progesterone. And the progesterone finishes the job of preparing the lining of the uterus, puts tubules in the lining to allow it to secrete mucus and materials, and supplies it with blood vessels which can eventually feed the embedding ovum. If the egg embeds itself in the wall of the uterus, blood vessels will grow towards it from the lining that has been prepared, and so on. So the egg begins to grow inside the uterus very rapidly, forms a placenta, and so on and so on. These are the female gonads. They represent an exteriorization of the sacral chakra, itself a six-petaled lotus, a six-petaled lotus. The chakra is much more difficult to arouse than the male chakra. Aroused, its energies are very difficult to control. They must sustain much of the activity of a developing fetus, and if the fetus is not there developing, to be developed, then those energies must go somewhere. They either remain focused in that region and can stimulate such difficult conditions as dysmenorrhea or menorrhagia, excessive bleeding or disorders of bleeding, persistence of the menstrual period of 3 days or 2 days into 5 days or 6 days. I've gone into this in great detail, comparative detail, in esoteric healing, pointing out how vitally important etheric vitamins are for the construction of the normal endometrium, where they are obtained, and so on. Equally so, if these sacral energies are not expressed in the sustaining of a fetus, they must go to the throat. And this is the reason why more women, far more women, suffer from hyperthyroidism or thyroid problem. Is that although the chakra is slow to arousal, once aroused, its energies must be expressed, and if they cannot be absorbed by a pregnancy, they will go to the throat. For the male, the energies are quickly aroused and quickly abate. They have to go to the throat, of course, when they are aroused. Excessive activity of the sacral region depletes the throat of the male, so that organisms like Streptococcus, that we described yesterday, will be a frequent inhabitant of such weakened throat centers. And the male youth is very frequently prone to sore throats and disorders in that region. The sensitive region, where the voice breaks, the larynx is closely energized by the throat center, I said a little earlier. The whole region is no longer a target of attention for the highest products of the fifth root race. If the procreative processes can be dealt with and dispensed with as quickly as possible in the individual's life, then the bringing up of those energies to the throat center will hasten, accelerate the opening of the head centers. It is truly said that the masters often wait very patiently for their beloved disciples of previous lives to get over the problem of the domestic life. And this implies, again, what I said earlier, that the throat chakra needs to be aroused and integrated as part and parcel of the process of integration of personality. Personality that can be distracted from its dedicated path into the fields of sexual involvement or emotional attachment or mental incapacity to concentrate or persist is a personality not yet ready to receive the attention of the master despite its service in previous lives. The male organs are to my mind, quite different in many respects, and indeed act very differently. But it should never be forgotten that the male contains within himself all the elements of the female, less developed. How less developed varies from person to person, from male to male. There may be quite an emphasis on female organs in one male and less emphasis on them in another male. Similarly with women, the male organ still exists in the mons pubis of the female, the slightly swollen area above the superior part of the labia majora, and here exists the clitoris, which is nothing more than a small penis which has never matured. So the female retains any element of the male. Hermaphrodism is not frequent on the planet, but it exists. And there are many, many examples of individuals with both male and female organs present at the same time. Witness to the fact, as Blavatsky says, testimony to the fact that man possessed duality of sex before the sexes separated in the middle of the third root race. The male organs are best drawn from the side view. We have, of course, kidneys which send their ureters down into the bladder, and there is again the urethra that emerges from the bladder. At its opening, as in the female, it is surrounded by contractile muscle, a sphincter muscle, which is partly under control of the will, allowing the urine to be evacuated at will. The urethra passes through a gland known as the prostate gland, and the prostate gland secretes a serous fluid into the urethra during the process of ejaculation. It contains still a tiny little body known as the ventricle, which is a residue of the female uterus that never grew. So the male contains within his sex organs the female part, just as the female contains the male. In the sixth root race, there will be a return to the hermaphrodite stage in the most advanced element. There will be the growth of androgynous beings who will produce offspring initially by their own endeavors. They will fertilize their own offspring. They will produce egg-born types eventually, and finally, in the seventh phase, duplication of the human will be primarily at an etheric level by what we might call binary fission of an etheric body into two, as occurred in the second root race earlier in our history. Remembering that the root races march on in this order: the first, the second, the third, the fourth is the most concretized, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. And they tend to act in similar ways. The second like the sixth, the third like the fifth, fourth like the opposite of the most spiritual. So going back to the human gonads, we have the urethra, which ends down under the pubic bone. I talked about a little earlier. Pubic bone as part of the pelvis, and then, as it were, forms the central structure of the male organ or phallus, penis. I think we better give that urethra a little bit of yellow color in here to make it clear. There we are. In the scrotum of the individual, there comes to lie the testes, which have been pulled down by the gubernaculum into this scrotal sac. They have brought with them a tube, which is the seminal tube, the vas deferens. They have brought that tube down with them, which is linked to the prostate gland. Just behind the bladder and attached to the vas deferens is a vesicle, another little bladder, which contains the male sperm, the male product of the testes. In the testes, and this is the endocrine gland, in the testes are produced male seeds or sperms, which by virtue of their flagella, their tails, are motile and able to move up the long tract of the vas deferens and are stored in the seminal vesicle. We're talking about semen, the male fluid that is produced, stored in the seminal vesicle behind the bladder, and when ejaculation occurs, muscular contraction set in motion by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves cause the muscles on the wall of the seminal vesicle to contract in conjunction with the prostate gland, and the bladder is sealed off and the seminal fluid passes down the urethra and is ejected into the female organ. So there we have the male gonads, and I have given something of their esoteric background. I want to talk now, having this freshly in your mind, of the venereal diseases. Remember that the disease known as gonorrhea is caused by the gonococcus, which has a bean-shaped diploid nucleus. It is an organism easily killed by drying out and must always exist in a wet medium. It is an organism that therefore is passed in most instances by sexual contact from one wet surface to another wet surface. Occasionally it is said that it is contracted from a wet lavatory seat or from sheets or other materials, but this is usually stated, at least in the East End of England, to placate a family who refuses to believe that the child, the little girl of the family, has contracted gonorrhea from any male member of the family. It's usually said then that she has picked it up from a lavatory seat at school. Highly unlikely. However, these statements have to be made in order to maintain family coherence. Be quite sure that they're not generally true. The effect of the gonorrheal action in the male is that the gonococcus will tend to enter the glans penis, the swollen portion on the end of the phallus, and will attack characteristic sites of the urethra. They will embed themselves and multiply in sensitive areas of the male urethra, and they will produce vast amounts of yellowish green material representing not only the gonococcus itself, but pus cells of white cells that have attacked the gonococcus in an attempt to defend the body. The individual feels nothing very much at first. About 4 days after sexual contact, experiences an irritation in the urethra, which may be pleasant to begin with, but soon becomes highly offensive in many respects. Produces searing, unbearable pain with the passing of urine over these regions that have been made raw. So much so that the individual will put off urination as long as possible. The material that exudes from the urethral, from the meatus of the phallus, stain the underclothing and they soon become unsightly. The cure of the condition is penicillin, great boon to mankind. 1 million units, injected, perhaps repeated several times, is enough to kill all the gonococcus in the body. If the individual is foolish enough to incur further infection, he will need probably much more penicillin to achieve the same result. continues to play around and contract the disease, penicillin becomes ineffective. And any alcohol, drinking of alcohol, or other unwise things brings an exacerbation of the gonorrhea. Sometimes eyes are infected, especially in women bearing children, and the first thing that should be done is the mopping of the baby's eyes and so on. In the female, the condition is more difficult to eliminate because the organism is able to reach into crevices and parts which are not easily, shall we say, reached by the penicillin. However, it can be cured relatively easily. It is a condition that often conceals itself, and women have to be encouraged to come to a venereal disease clinic. I don't think any of this is really part of our problem of esoteric healing. What we are likely to encounter is the male is an enlarged prostate gland, and I can say outright that our audience here, the male audience, is free from prostate disorders. How do I know that? Well, in a long lecture or after a long lecture, when the lecture comes to an end, even before it comes to an end, the middle-aged men or aging men bolt for the door to go to the toilet as quick as they can, because prostate conditions make the holding of urine almost unbearable. So you can usually tell at the end of a long lecture, and I haven't observed any male evacuants from the audience. There were several at the certificate, at the diploma. I hope you won't embarrass us all by noting their hurried departure at the next certificate. These are little things that you pick up, of course, as you go on in life and on. Then there is the problem of syphilis itself. Syphilis is described as the great mimicker. It mimics all diseases, mimics just about everything. Name a disease and its symptoms, and you'll find similar symptoms in syphilis. The condition caused by Trypanosoma pallidum, it's a spirochete organism that I drew for you the other night, and its effects are far worse than gonorrhea, and they become worse with their chronicity. We talk about venereal disease in terms of various stages. I can't remember so much about the disorder, but I can tell you what I do remember. Venereal disease, syphilis, yes. This is usually passed on with sexual contact, and the sexual contact need not necessarily be confined in the male and female to the sex organs. The infection may be found in the region of the breasts or the nipples, may be found on the mouth, on the lips. It is characterized initially by a sore that develops on the glands of the penis, and it is a sore that is painless, and it has a punched out appearance. It's just as if the surface of the skin has just been punched out like that. It's known as a primary chancre, And just when the individual is getting very worried about it, it disappears. And that only means probably that the organism has now managed to infect the bloodstream, and it is passing around the bloodstream, and the next appearance of the condition may be a characteristic syphilitic rash all over the body. The individual is worried, may stay at home, and hide himself, and so on. And again, just when he is really getting worried by the stage of development of the condition, the rash disappears, it goes away. And he may survive that stage and still do nothing about it. And the next thing is that the organism gets into the nervous system, the brain, gets into the bones, and as long as 10, 12, 15 years later, after infection, sores can develop on the surface of the body, holes appearing, and degeneration of all tissue in the area, even holes going right through the bone. And the final stage is what is known as general paralysis of the insane, where the organisms attack the central nervous system and brain, and characteristic degeneration of intelligence follows rapidly. There's a grossing of the person's appetites, lack of concern or care or decorum, slovenliness, a collapse of the bridge of the nose, giving a typical syphilitic nose, which on the individual would be, instead of like that, would be like that. Nose where the bridge has just about disappeared. Penicillin will halt the disease at any stage. It cannot repair the damage that has been done, or even halt the general paralysis of the insane with massive doses. The individual has reached a stage of degeneration which cannot be changed. So it is a horrifying condition. But it is a condition that is a reflection of the karma of Lemuria. There are certain individuals in whom it would become much, much worse, and it has its karma to work out. Obviously, it should be cured, reported as quickly as possible. What is probably most devastating about it is that the husband can infect the wife unknowingly. She may have been abroad and contracted the disease and gone through the two stages that I first described, and quite unknowingly remain infected and pass the infection onto the wife. And this can go on for as long as 12 years later after he has finally become infected. So it's a condition that we need to bear in mind. I don't like to talk about it, but I think that it has a message for us, and that is to spell for us what racial degeneracy can bring. Racial degeneracy. And it wasn't degeneracy of tissue, rather than the excessive use of a chakra, excessive use of the sacral center. Separation of the sexes produced a rapid growth of the sacral chakra, so that its control became almost unmanageable by the Lemurian types, and its excessive expression led to the spread and growth of the trypanosoma pallidum organism. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say on this course. I'm sorry that we should end on such a note of degeneracy, but I feel that we have run quite a gamut of conditions. I know that this course will be useful to you all your lives, and I hope that it will be extremely useful to you in your esoteric healing. Now,